The question has been asked in many ways. One way to ask it, colloquially, is morality made up? We're going to talk about a few different ways to formulate this question. And this example I want to start with is asking the question in an applied way, is morality like cilantro or science? So some people like cilantro, some people don't, and it kind of seems like whether cilantro is good or not just depends on whether you like it or not, whether it tastes good in your mouth. The things that are going on in your head in terms of taste and preference are determining whether cilantro is good for you. In fact, you might even think there's no sense to be made of the claim that cilantro is good. We need to talk about whether cilantro is good for you or whether it's good for me. Claims about whether cilantro is good are always, to use academic jargon, indexed to the individual. But compare this to scientific truths. Scientific truths about, say, the shape of the earth or the structure of the atom or any other scientific claim are true regardless of what's going on in your head, with one important proviso, which we'll talk about in a second. That is, they are true, and what you think or want or prefer has no impact on that truth. Whether the earth is flat or round is true or obtains regardless of what you think or feel or want to be the case. So compare these two domains of taste, generally speaking, that's cilantro, where something is good, and that just depends on what you like or want, and then the domain of science, where it seems like the truths are true independently of what people want or think or feel or prefer. The one proviso there, the one exception, are sciences that deal with what's happening in a person's mind, like psychology. There it's sort of an exception, and we could try to make sense of that, but we don't need to get into that. There, the truths of psychology do depend on what's happening in someone's head. But we can just bracket that for a second, put it to the side. It's a complicating factor, and let's deal with the clear cases. And so the question is, in which of these two camps does morality belong? Is morality a matter of taste, more like a matter of taste? Or is it more like science? And we could call the matters of taste subjective, depending on what's happening in a person's head. The truths aren't true objectively. And similarly, we could call truths of science objective truths. They're true independently of what people want or feel or think. So is morality like cilantro? Is it subjective or is it objective like science? And we could point to some similarities, and we'll get into that. But right now we're trying to frame the question. So this question goes all the way back to, at least, to Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher. He had a dialogue that he wrote about some characters, one of whom was Euthyphro and one of whom was Socrates, and they're having this conversation, and they're talking about piety. Piety being what you owe to the gods or what your religious duties are, this sort of thing. And Euthyphro is talking about what's pious, and Socrates asks him this question and says, well, let me ask you this, Euthyphro. The gods love what's pious, right? And Euthyphro's like, yeah, sure. And he says, well, do the gods love it because it's pious, or is it pious because they love it? That's the crucial question here. And it turns out, long story short, you can go read that dialogue for yourself, but the answer turns out to be very hard to give. The answer is not what we're interested in here. The question is what we're really interested in. Because Socrates gives us a framework for understanding this basic distinction. And the framework is, do facts about piety, and we're going to generalize that to all of morality, do they depend on the gods' preferences? Or do the gods' preferences really depend on facts about piety, which are independent of those preferences? So it's a question about the order of dependence. You could call this metaphysical dependence. You could get fancy with it in that way, but we can keep it simple and say, what explains what? We deal with this question all the time, right? When we deal with a correlation, we're talking about a different sense of explanation, causal explanation, but we're asking about, we don't know yet when there's a correlation, which factor is explaining which. One famous correlation is between ice creams sold and murders. Turns out there's a, at least short frame, correlation between the amount of ice cream being sold and the amount of murders being committed. And we could ask ourselves, which factor is explaining which? Now, there's this third possibility. Well, there's multiple possibilities. One is that there is no causal correlate or no causal connection at all, right? There's another possibility, which is that there's some third factor which is explaining both things. But our initial thought might be, is one of these two things explaining causally the other? Is it the fact that people buying more ice cream leads to more murders somehow? Or is it the fact that when murders go up, for some reason that causes people to buy more ice cream? We can wonder that. And what we're asking in the causal domain there is what explains what between these two things. Again, it might be neither, right? It might be that neither explains the other. But that could be a first thought. And similarly here, Socrates is asking the same question, not with a causal explanation, but you might think with a normative or a metaphysical explanation. What explains what? Do our desires and our preferences explain morality? Or is morality unexplained by our desires and preferences, only ever explaining why we feel the way we do? That's the question, generalized beyond just piety and the gods. Socrates is asking a specific form of that question. But the general question is, do our preferences and desires and mental states in general explain morality? Or does morality only ever explain our mental states? This is the question of the objectivity or the subjectivity of morality. It could also be described as the question of the mind independence or the mind dependence of morality. Morality would be mind dependent if it depends in this sense, whatever that is, on our mental states. Mind independent when it doesn't. There are at least some truths on the second option, mind independence. If you think morality is mind independent, there are at least some moral truths that hold independently of what anyone thinks or feels or prefers or whatever. Okay, so the purpose of this video is to get the distinction, the really rough distinction down there. And turns out there are some puzzles about the distinction. That's a plan for a future video. But just to finish up the video and to sort of flesh out the distinction, let's talk about two kinds of cases. One which might push us towards the mind dependence camp, and another kind of case which might push us towards the mind independence camp. And we'll end by talking about what sort of intuitive or implicit test we're relying on when we think about these cases. So the first case, what really motivates the thought that morality might be mind dependent are cases that are more trivial or culturally bound. So think about the question of whether when you go to a Muslim country as a woman, you ought morally wear a head covering. It's like expected in that culture. It would be offensive if you didn't. People might have serious distress, maybe, if it's a very universal thing there, at seeing a woman without her head covered. So you could argue you're causing harm or something like this. But the basic question is, well, should you do it just because people there think you should? And a lot of people will say, yeah, you should. And they'll give different explanations for why. But ultimately, the thought is that, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. You have moral obligations here that depend on what's happening in the culture and what the culture thinks, what's happening ultimately in people's heads, right? And so cases like this could make you think that morality is mind dependent. There's a whole different class of cases that could lead you to think that morality is mind independent if you focus on these sorts of cases. And these are, I think, generally unified by their moral graveness. So think about cases of, for example, genocide. Think about the Holodomor in Ukraine or the Holocaust in much of Europe. Think about any genocide, the Rwandan genocide, and ask yourself, do I really think that its wrongness just depends on the fact that people think it's wrong or don't want it to happen or something like that? So one test you can run here is what's called a counterfactual test. And you ask yourself, what if everyone thought this was okay? Would it be okay? And you can see the pull, hopefully, of claiming yeah, it just wouldn't be okay, right? Even if everyone decided it was okay to commit this genocide, maybe even if the perpetrators convinced the victims that it was okay, right? They engaged in some clever brainwashing. It might seem like no matter what, this is wrong, and no matter what anyone thinks, it's wrong. Now, you might, for whatever reason those examples don't appeal to you, think about the thing you're most centrally committed to morally, and then run that counterfactual test on it. Ask yourself, well, if everyone disagreed, if everyone's mind was suddenly changed, would the moral truth suddenly change? And you might find yourself having trouble thinking, yeah, it would change. It changes with people's opinions. You might want to stand your ground and say, no, the moral truth holds here regardless of what anyone thinks. That is the mind dependence versus mind independence distinction, the subjective versus objective distinction in what's called metaethics, thinking about the status of morality. And that's the question of whether morality is ultimately made up.